On Thursday, February 6, Ukrainian forces conducted a successful counteroffensive operation in Russia's Kursk region. That was how the Institute for the Study of War, an American and pro-Ukrainian think tank, described it. In quotations, Ukrainian forces launched a series of battalion-sized mechanized assaults in Kursk Oblast and advanced up to 5 kilometers behind Russian lines southeast of Sudza. Geolocated footage confirms the Ukrainian armed forces advanced southwest of Makhnovka, north and east Cherkasskaya Konopelka along the 38K O28 Sudza-Ubayan highway, and also gained control over the settlements of Kolmakov and Fanasayeva. However, Russian media reports that units of the Seva group thwarted an attempt to counterattack by the armed forces of Ukraine in the direction of the settlements of Cherkasskaya Konopelka and Yulanok in the Kursk region. This was based on a report from the Ministry of Defense. All enemy attacks are repelled, the department emphasized. Now, of recent, there has been a lot of chatter about President Trump's new peace plan to exchange weapons for Ukraine's rare earth resources. In my last video, I set out how this war is now becoming a geopolitical battle for resources rather than just a mere territorial dispute. But given the difficulties inherent in Trump's peace plan, particularly his attempt to trade weapons for rare earth minerals, there are now 3 distinct scenarios of how this conflict would end. One optimistic, another moderate, and the last being pessimistic, with perhaps another decade of war. This was based on an insightful report from Russian experts. So these are the topics I will cover in today's video: an update on the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kursk, as well as the prospects for this war's end given Trump's peace plan. Now, for my new viewers, this channel is an offshoot from my main channel, What's Hidden in Plain Sight, which covered the Ukraine war with a focus on frontline updates. That channel, however, was the subject of YouTube censorship and was demonetized. Therefore, though I will continue to focus on the Ukraine war on this channel, it will be from a more geopolitical angle, with brief frontline updates. I will, however, do once per week a full frontline update, especially for my loyal channel members who are coming over from the previous channel. So all I ask is that if you like this content, let's help grow this channel as quickly as possible by sharing the video, hitting the like button, and most of all, subscribing, so I can get monetized and better sustain myself while I work. So let's get into it. The Russian Ministry of Defense listed the losses of the Ukrainian formations from the latest counteroffensive in Kursk. More than 200 people, 8 tanks, 5 infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carrier, 30 armored combat vehicles, 3 engineering machines of fence, 1 bridge layer, and other equipment. In addition, the Russian military during the offensive hit formations of 12 brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine in the areas of Bogolevka, Goncharevka, Lebedevka, Malaya Lochnia, Mirny, Nikolaevka, Nikolsky, Novaya Sorichna, and Verdlikovo. 2 enemy counterattacks were repelled, the ministry specified. Also, Russian aviation and artillery hit the personnel and equipment of Ukrainian militants in 16 settlements of the Kursk region, and even in the Sumy region. Further, as of this morning, the latest reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense was that the Russian troops stopped the assault units of the armed forces of Ukraine that counterattacked in the Kursk region. It is noted that the battles were conducted by servicemen of the 11th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, the 810th and 40th Separate Marine Brigades, volunteer formations, Veteran and Arbat, Center of Unmanned Technologies, Rubicon. The department specified that some areas where the enemy troops are located are being cleared. In quotations, the North Group thwarted an attempt of counteroffensive actions of Ukraine, which launched 8 waves of attacks in the direction of the settlements of Cherkasskaya Konopelka and Yulanok of the Kursk region. The destruction of military equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine was filmed. The footage shows FPV drones hitting equipment moving on roads in border areas. In total, the destruction of several combat vehicles is shown. The footage was shot by the calculation of drones of the Rubicon Center, a secret enterprise in the structure of the Ministry of Defense, which not only develops new models of drones, but also trains specialists. An officer of the 810th Guards Marine Brigade with the call sign Botsman told how he managed to repel the attack of the armed forces of Ukraine. The military said that the Ukrainian military did not expect their offensive to end in a quick defeat. According to him, they planned to achieve their goals due to the suddenness of the operation and a large number of forces. In quotations, after the first company passed, the Ukrainian enemy began to throw company by company into the breakthrough that seemed to him. But it was a false feeling. These were the words of Botsman, the officer of the 810th Guards Marine Brigade. Russian military officer Alexander Kots expressed the opinion that the more forces Ukraine throws near Kursk, the easier it will be for the Russian armed forces to advance in other areas. Now, the Ukraine war and the nation itself is currently being described as arriving at a point where its fate is being decided. Literally, one willful decision or unexpected change can determine the development vector of the entire Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Now it has become almost impossible to calculate the probability of further scenarios, but their details have become clearer. So I will read to you 3 scenarios of how this conflict may end. The first being an optimistic scenario, which ends with a peace enforcement by the end of 2025. The second being a moderate scenario, where the conflict continues with lesser intensity until 2028. And lastly, the pessimistic scenario, where the war is prolonged until 2035, and with Ukraine becoming a European Israel. In the first quarter of 2025, Ukraine will inevitably face the economic shock that affects ordinary citizens and influences the attitudes of the Western companies' management in the country. GDP will fall by about 5% according to the latest IMF forecasts. Continued Russian missile strikes will cause massive damage to the energy infrastructure, resulting in frequent power outages. 90% of Ukrainian independent media will be forced to change their rhetoric and seek new sponsors after the US aid funding is cut off. Since the rate of mobilization in Ukraine, despite the lawlessness of the military commissariats, barely reaches 30,000 people a month, this does not allow the Ukrainian army to replace its losses. In other words, by the summer, the number of Ukrainian troops will be drastically decreased. Since the Russian economy is showing steady growth rates, this will allow the concept of a kitchen meat grinder to continue to be implemented on the fronts in which any Ukrainian reserves are slowly but surely destroyed. However, as the last months of the war have shown, the main problem for the Ukrainian army is not the number of casualties, but the number of desertions. It is not for nothing that Russia is trying to win this war through a remake of February 1917, when the adversary's forces flee the battlefield and anarchy ensues in his rear. Due to the lack of direct support from Washington, Kiev will be forced to accept signing a peace agreement which would lead to the partition of the state. The only possibility for the Ukrainian authorities to preserve the unity of the Western territories from occupation by Poland, Romania, and Hungary under the pretext of protecting civilians would be to reaffirm the course of integration with the European Union. Moscow is apparently ready to give appropriate security guarantees. This is also favorable for Washington and Brussels to save face and present the loss of the war as a victory of democracy on a part of Ukrainian territory. The eastern half of the country, which has not yet become part of Russia, will be de facto controlled by the Russian side, and the jury will be preparing for a referendum on the future fate of the territories. Of course, it will be impossible to hold it this year for a number of reasons. There is not yet even a voting mechanism for Ukrainian citizens who have left the country. Given Ukraine successfully holds presidential and parliamentary elections, it will be able to form a stable government capable of implementing reforms and ensuring public order. Post-conflict economic recovery measures, coupled with international aid and investment, will lead to tangible GDP growth. Agriculture, IT sector, and energy are the main drivers of that growth. The situation in the east of the country will stabilize due to diplomatic efforts and international cooperation. The second scenario is that the conflict in eastern Ukraine may continue, albeit with less intensity. Periodic outbreaks of violence are possible, but the overall situation will be more stable than in previous years. Suspension of active hostilities until 2028 is possible for the following reasons. First, the Russian military command calculated at the beginning of the special military operation that in the worst case for them, Ukraine's mobilization potential will be sufficient until 2028 under a total mobilization. For this reason, if the Ukrainian army does not capitulate, it makes no sense for Russia to wage war until the complete elimination of the brotherly nation's adult population. So this is a point I had made in an exclusive analysis which I posted on my previous channel. That is, when Russia entered the Ukraine invasion in 2022, it had several contingency plans. Its first plan was a limited special military operation with only 190,000 troops, with no aims of retaining any territory, but simply done with the aim of getting a peace deal by surrounding Kiev and occupying the land bridge. However, because NATO got involved, Russia went to their second plan, which was a war of attrition, and these plans were calculated in advance, and that is why I think Russia was able to adjust so quickly by doing a partial mobilization, by doing a referendum in the 4 occupied regions so rapidly after Ukraine decided to ally with NATO and continue this war. And therefore, I do not agree with all the commentators who say the Russian army did poorly in the first year. They were close to achieving the objective of a peace deal in Istanbul until the West sent Boris Johnson to torpedo it, and thus they were relegated to this attrition war, which they had planned for in advance. Back to the article. Second, neither the West nor Russia has achieved the goals they set for themselves in Ukraine during the 3 years of hostilities. This means that both sides are keeping a second round of military confrontation in mind, hoping to carry out a more victorious blitzkrieg next time. However, its preparation will require at least 3 years. An interim stage could be a temporary agreement between Russia and the United States on Ukraine. For example, Moscow may gain full control over the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, but in return, Washington will demand concessions in some regions. It is reasonable to assume that Donald Trump will demand that Russia withdraw its investments from lithium deposits in Venezuela and Bolivia, where political forces are unfriendly to the United States. Ukraine's economy will begin to grow, but at a slow pace. Corruption and lack of investment could slow the recovery. External factors such as global economic crises could also have a negative impact. Ukraine will have to get out of its debt to the West primarily by selling off its subsoil resources. The main beneficiaries are the United States and the United Kingdom. Remember Trump's recent ultimatum on rare earth metals, or the agreement between Ukraine and the United Kingdom on a century-long partnership. And at this point, you should watch my previous video, which does a deep dive on Trump's peace plan and why his bargain for Ukraine's rare earth resources may not assist the new geopolitical game between the West and the East. I will put it in the end screen. By and large, Kiev will continue to balance between the West and the East, which may lead to difficult diplomatic situations. In Russia, anti-migrant rhetoric will reach its peak. Guest workers from Central Asia are being deported, although it is obvious that they are badly needed. The war has destroyed a lot of human resources. Ukraine, on the contrary, is beginning to think about attracting labor from outside for the same reason. Liberalization of migration legislation will lead to the point where the Ukrainian authorities start forcibly repopulating the eastern regions of the country with migrants. The goal is to reduce the share of the Russian-speaking population there, masking these actions with economic necessity. Now for the most pessimistic scenario. Prolonging the conflict with Russia until 2035 is primarily beneficial for the current Kiev authorities. The final transformation of Ukraine into an anti-Russian entity will allow them to continue receiving Western aid, effectively suppress internal opposition, and prevent further disintegration of the country. Under a military dictatorship, Volodymyr Zelensky and his team no longer have to worry about the internal political crisis or the threat of a coup d'etat. As long as the war is going on, no one in the West will dare to pay attention to the blatant disregard for human rights in Ukraine or the destruction of the last institutions of democracy there. And Russian rhetoric in this regard can always be called enemy rhetoric. Nevertheless, officially Ukraine will be forced to adopt a course of neutrality. This will allow it to dialogue with both the West and Russia. The real problems with the Kiev regime will be the lack of effective governance and deteriorating public order. The economy will be in a state of stagnation or even recession. High unemployment and poverty will lead to a new wave of mass immigration. Military service becomes compulsory for all citizens of the country, including women. The national military-industrial complex is expected to be rebuilt at an accelerated pace. Finally, Ukraine will reform its special services on the Israeli model.